She had sung to the sleeping Duke of Ravensford for 7 years, and on the 8th October of his stillness, he answered her. The candle was nearly burned through, and her voice, low, steady, an old Welsh hush song her mother had used to coax fevers out of children, had reached the part where the river forgets the sea. Elowyn Ashcombe sat where she always sat, on the low oak stool drawn close to the great bed, her right hand resting loosely on his right hand, because the surgeon had once told her 7 years ago that touch carried into sleep where speech sometimes did not. She had not been certain she believed him. She had touched the Duke's hand every dusk anyway. His fingers tightened on hers. The sound she made was not a scream. Screams require breath taken first, and she had no breath. It was a small, sharp inhalation, the noise a person makes when stepping unexpectedly into cold water. And she froze, with the hush song still half on her tongue, and her eyes locked on the bed. Julian Ravensford opened his eyes. They were grey. Of course they were grey. She had known they were grey. His grandmother had told her so the very first night, although the dowager had wept while she said it, and Elowyn, at 18, had not understood that grief could outlive the cause for grief by 7 years. His eyes were grey, and they were not vague. They were focused on her face, with the unblinking precision of a man who has been listening, and listening, and listening, and now is at last permitted to look. His mouth moved. The first sound was not a word. It was the dry rasp of a throat that had not formed a syllable in 84 months. And Elowyn's training as a music master's daughter took over before her panic could. She reached for the cup on the bedside table without taking her eyes off him, slid her arm under his shoulders, and held the rim to his lips. He swallowed. He swallowed again. His grey eyes did not leave her. "Never stop," he said. His voice was hoarse and quiet, and absolutely his own. "Never," he said again, more clearly. "Stop." Elowyn Ashcombe had been told for 7 years that he could not hear her, and she had sung anyway. She had been told for 7 years that her presence at his bedside was a sentimental indulgence the dowager paid for out of her own widow's portion. She had been told for 7 years that the Duke of Ravensford was, in every meaningful sense, a body without a tenant. She had not, in 7 years, allowed any of it to silence her, because her father, who had been the Duke's tutor, who had brought her to this house at 18, who had been carried out of it again on a stretcher in the spring of her 20th year, and was buried in the parish churchyard half a mile down the lane, her father had told her on his last morning, "He will hear you, child. Sing him out." And so she had sung. She had not, however, prepared a response for the moment he answered. She set the cup down with hands that betrayed her at last, and shook so violently that water ran across the polished wall mat. "Your Grace," she said. The honorific came automatically, learned by habit, though she had not used it aloud in 7 years. She had used his given name when she sang. "Your Grace, lie still. I will fetch—" "Don't," he said. His grey eyes were on her mouth now, watching the shape of her words as if he could not yet trust his ears alone. "Sing. Your Grace, sing." His hand, the one that had tightened on hers, rose 3 trembling inches off the counterpane and fell again, weak with the weight of 7 years' atrophy. "Or I will think I dreamed you." So Elowyn Ashcombe, 25 years old, daughter of a country music master, the sole surviving member of her family, drew breath and sang the river and sea verse from the beginning, while she pulled the bell cord above his head with her free hand to summon the household. By the time the dowager's footsteps came hurrying down the long gallery, by the time Dr. Calder emerged from the steward's wing with his coat still half-buttoned, by the time the great house of Ravensford Hall began the noise that had been waiting in its walls for 7 years, Elowyn had reached the river meeting sea, and Julian Ravensford was watching her face, and his grey eyes were full of tears. He did not weep. He did not have the strength yet to weep. But the tears slid sideways across his temples into his hair, and Elowyn sang on as if she did not see them, because if she stopped, She was not sure either of them would be able to begin again. Dr. Calder arrived first because he had been only across the courtyard, eating the late supper Mrs. Harrow always put aside for him on the days he stayed late in the Duke's rooms. He came in with the flushed irritation of a man interrupted at his stew and the immediate professional silence of a man who has just understood what he is looking at. He did not speak for a full minute. He stood at the foot of the bed with his hands behind his back, his white hair untidy, and he watched Julian Ravensford watch Elowen sing. And Elowen saw the surgeon's eyes go from grey to her own and back again, performing some calculation she could not follow. Miss Ashcombe. Doctor? How long? He spoke perhaps 4 minutes ago. What did he say? She hesitated. The first words a man says after 7 years of silence belonged in some sense to the man who said them. She did not know whether they were hers to repeat. But Dr. Calder was looking at her with the particular patient firmness she had come to know as his bedside discipline, and she answered him truthfully. He told me not to stop singing. The doctor's mouth did something that was not exactly a smile. Of course he did, he said, very quietly, as if this confirmed an old private theory. He came to the side of the bed opposite Elowen and laid 2 fingers on the Duke's wrist. Your Grace, can you hear me? Julian's eyes moved with effort toward the doctor. Yes. Do you know who I am? A pause. Then, with the slow, working patience of a man rebuilding a cathedral from 1 stone at a time. Calder, you set my arm when I was 14. I did, Your Grace. Calder's voice did not change pitch, but his eyes briefly closed. Do you know who is sitting beside you? The grey gaze slid back to Elowen's face. He looked at her the way a man looks at a window after a long blindness, measuring the light, trying to remember what is on the other side. She has, he said, and the syllables came slow and deliberate. A voice like rain finding stone. She is sometimes called Elowen. She is the daughter of the music master who taught me Italian when I was 17. She has been at this bedside. He stopped. His brows drew faintly together. How long has she been at this bedside, Calder? The doctor did not look at Elowen. 7 years, Your Grace. The silence that followed had its own weight. Julian closed his eyes briefly. Not from exhaustion, Elowen thought, but from a private reckoning she could not enter. When he opened them again, he did not look at the doctor. He looked at her. Forgive me, he said. It was so unexpected that for a moment she could not answer. There is nothing to forgive, she said at last. You were not awake to choose. I am awake now, he said. His voice was steadier than it had been 5 minutes earlier. She could already hear it remembering itself. And I am asking you to forgive me for the 7 years of your life that I took without knowing. You did not take them, Elowen said. He looked at her so steadily that she felt her own pulse in her throat. Then who did? He asked. She had no answer for that. She had asked herself the same question 1,000 times, in 1,000 quiet, small hours, sitting on the oak stool while the candle burned, and his face did not move. And her father had been 4 years buried, and the dowager had been the only living person in the house who knew her name without it being a courtesy. She had no answer, and she had learned not to ask the question aloud, because a question without an answer becomes, in time, a kind of slow disease of the spirit. But Dr. Calder, who had finished counting the Duke's pulse, replied with the dry precision of a man choosing his words like surgical thread. Time, he said, had taken them, as it always did. Miss Ashcombe had given them. There was a difference between what was taken and what was offered, he observed, and only the giver knew which it was. Then the dowager came in. Lady Vivian Ravensford was 72 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, dressed at this hour in a ruby-red wool dressing gown over her nightclothes, and she crossed the bedchamber at a speed Elowen had not previously seen her achieve. She did not weep. The Dowager Ravensford had learned to weep on the schedule of her own choosing, and not on the schedule of her grief. She came to the bedside, took her grandson's other hand in both of hers, and said, in a voice that did not tremble, "Julian, you are late for breakfast." His grey eyes shifted to her face, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a smaller, more tentative smile than perhaps it would have been 7 years ago. But it was a smile. "I will dress directly, grandmother." "You will not," said the Dowager. "You will lie there until Calder tells you otherwise." "Calder? I trust him to you. Miss Ashcombe, come with me." Aylwin did not move at first. Her hand was still under Julian's hand, and his fingers, though weak, had not let go. The Dowager observed this with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had run a great house for 50 years, and her eyebrows did one small particular thing. And then she said, more gently, "5 minutes, child. I shall return you. There is a matter that cannot wait." So Aylwin rose, slipping her hand carefully out from under his, and Julian's fingers, almost without his volition, followed her hand a fraction of an inch across the counterpane, before sinking again. He watched her go. He watched her all the way to the door. She did not look back, because if she had, she might have stayed. In the long gallery, the Dowager closed the bedchamber door behind them and leaned her small, straight back against it. "Cassius is in the house," she said. Aylwin's stomach contracted without her permission. The Dowager explained, in the brief, level voice she used for matters that had to be communicated and could not be discussed, that the Duke's male cousin had arrived at Ravensford that very afternoon, while Aylwin had been walking back from the village, that she had not yet decided how to manage him, that she would manage him now, and Aylwin need not concern herself with the particulars. The Dowager's grey eyes, Julian had inherited them, they were the same precise grey, were fixed on Aylwin's face throughout, and what they conveyed was a great deal sterner than anything she said aloud. From the moment her grandson had opened his eyes, every hour of Aylwin's life in that house was going to be measured by a man who had spent 7 years assuming the house would be his. The Dowager did not need to elaborate. Aylwin began, faintly, to protest that she had no claim on the household. The Dowager cut her off with a small, dry word, observing that she, the Dowager, had always known that perfectly well, and that Cassius did not. Cassius Ravensford was 27 years old, possessed of the same fine bones his cousin had possessed before 7 years of stillness gaunted them, and he wore that night a deep burgundy waistcoat under a coat the colour of strong tea. He had chestnut hair brushed forward in the London fashion. He had hazel eyes, very nearly amber in candlelight, which he was not above using. He had the smile of a man who had learned in childhood that handsome is a tool, not a gift, and had refined his use of it ever since. He was also, Aylwin had long ago concluded, the kind of man who would have been more dangerous if he had been less beautiful, because a face like his persuaded otherwise sensible people to believe his first sentence before he had finished his second. He was waiting in the steward's office, because the steward's office was where the estate ledgers were kept, and Cassius had been keeping them for 4 years. He rose when the Dowager entered. He did not rise quite as quickly as he ought to have done. He made it look as though courtesy required only a graceful unfolding, and not the prompt jerk of obligation. He bowed over his great-aunt's hand. He turned to Aylwin with the particular smile he kept for her, which contained 1 part charm, 1 part appraisal, and 1 part the assumption that she would be pleased to be smiled at. He greeted Aylwin first, with a courtesy he had calibrated for her over 4 years and had not yet found cause to revise. He hoped the household had not been imposing on her kindness during his absence. She looked weary. He trusted she was sleeping. The Dowager cut across these civilities without apology and informed him plainly that his cousin had woken, had spoken, had recognized Calder and Miss Ashcombe both. The smile remained on Cassius's face for perhaps half a second longer than it should have. Then it faded. Aylwin, watching with the trained attention of a woman who had spent 7 years studying the face of an unconscious man for the smallest tremor of meaning, saw what passed underneath. Not horror, exactly. Not relief. A swift, calculating recalibration, as if a man at a card table had just been informed the deck contained an additional suit. He inquired, with a careful lightness, what the Duke had said. The Dowager, her mouth small and bloodless and perfectly composed, told him that the Duke had told Miss Ashcombe not to stop singing. "How charming," said Cassius after a beat. "And how very Julian. He always had a sentimental ear." He turned the smile on Aylwin again, and now there was something underneath it, a brittleness she had not seen in his face before. He observed that she must be astonished, that he was astonished himself, that he had begun to consider her devotion a kindness offered to a man who could no longer reward it, and now he saw it was to be rewarded after all. "I sang because I was asked to sing, sir," Aylwin said, more quietly than she had intended. "Not for reward." He waved this away with a small, light gesture, and turned to the Dowager to ask whether he might see his cousin. The Dowager refused, civilly. Calder was with the Duke. The Duke had spoken his first words within the hour, and was not yet a man one might visit. He was a man one might pray for. Cassius accepted this with the tightest of smiles, and observed, dryly, that he had been praying for his cousin for 7 years. He did not look at Aylwin as he said this, but Aylwin, who had stood at the door of the Duke's bedchamber every dusk for 7 years and had counted the visitors, could have told him precisely how often he had set foot in that room. She had counted 9 times. She did not say so. The Dowager, she suspected, had counted as well, and would mention it at her own choosing. Cassius bowed and went. When the door had closed, the Dowager looked at Aylwin for a long moment. Then she crossed the small carpet and put one tiny, dry hand on Aylwin's wrist, and informed her, with the unappealable softness of a woman who had run a great house for 50 years and had no patience for argument at the end of a day, that Aylwin would not sleep in her own narrow chamber that night. She would sleep in the green chamber, which was across the corridor from the Dowager's own, and Mrs. Harrow would lay a fire there. The Dowager added, in an entirely conversational voice, that she would be obliged if Aylwin did not argue with her at the end of the longest day of her life. Aylwin did not argue. She slept 4 hours. She dreamed of nothing. She had been 18 the first time she crossed the threshold of Ravensford Hall, and she had been afraid. This memory came back to her, unbidden, in the grey hour before dawn, while she was lying in the strange green chamber with the fire her ladyship had ordered burned down to embers. She did not try to push the memory away. It had returned to her at intervals across 7 years. She had given up resisting it. It came with the sound of her father's voice and the smell of horse and damp wool, and her father saying gently, "Stand straight, Aylwin. He does not see you, but he hears you. Stand the way you would stand if he could see." Mr. Ashkin had taught Italian and rhetoric and music to 2 generations of Ravensford boys. He had taught Julian Ravensford from the age of 7 to the age of 17. Diligent boy, the elder Ashcombe used to say, with a real ear, and a habit of asking the question his teacher had hoped not to be asked. When Julian had been thrown from his horse on the Easter Eve of his 21st year, returning at speed from a fire at the Wensleydale farm, where one of his tenants had been trapped under a fallen beam, the tenant, a man called Ainsley, had been pulled clear by Julian himself before the Duke remounted to ride for help. When Julian had been thrown, and had struck his head on the stone milepost at the bottom of the Ravensford lane, and had not woken from the blow, the family surgeon had tried every art he knew, and then he had sent for Aylwin's father. He had not sent for him as a tutor. He had sent for him as a man who knew the Duke better than any surviving relative, and who could tell them whether the boy he had taught for 10 years would have wanted his life prolonged in a body that did not answer. Mr. Ashcombe had ridden up to Ravensford Hall in the rain, and had sat at Julian's bedside for 2 hours. The room he sat in had been quickly and inadequately rearranged for a long illness. 2 heavy chairs had been moved to the far wall to make space for a low cot the Dowager had ordered set against the bed for the night nurses. The carpets had been rolled back from the hearth, and a brass spittoon, empty, kept brushed, placed where the carpet had ended. The smell of the room was unfamiliar to him. Lavender water, beeswax, the bitter tincture Calder had been administering, and behind all of these, very faintly, the smell of a young man who was not moving, and was not, in any visible respect, any longer a young man at all. Mr. Ashcombe sat for 2 hours by the bedside and listened, to Julian's breath, to Calder's small movements at the table by the window, to the rain on the high panes, and at the end of those 2 hours he had said, quietly, "He would have wanted to be sung to." "Sung to," said Dr. Calder. "Lady Vivian," said Mr. Ashcombe, "Your Grace," and begged her to forgive a country tutor's overreach. The Duke's mother had sung. He had told Mr. Ashcombe so when he was 9. She had been lost to him before he could properly remember her face. But he had remembered her voice, and he had kept that voice in his ear his whole boyhood as one keeps an ember. If there was any sound that could reach the Duke where he had gone, Mr. Ashcombe ventured. It was a woman singing. Not for show. For him. "Where," said the Dowager, "do you propose I find such a woman?" Mr. Ashcombe had looked at her. He was a small, neat, grey-haired widower of 54. He was a man who had outlived his wife by a decade, and did not enjoy raising the matter. "I have a daughter," he had said. So Aylwyn had come, at 18, in a russet wool travelling gown and her mother's indigo cloak that was already too short in the sleeves. She had stood at the foot of the great bed, in the great room with the painted ceiling, and she had looked at the white face on the pillow, and she had been, plainly, terrified. Not of him, of the room, of the wealth and the height of the painted ceiling, and of the certainty that a country music master's daughter had no business in such a room. Her father had set his hand briefly between her shoulder blades. "Sing, Aylwyn, the Welsh one your mother used, the river song. Begin softly. He will hear it before he hears anything else." She had sung. She had sung on a held breath that broke twice in the first verse and steadied by the third. She had sung in front of the Dowager, and Dr. Calder, and her own father, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Harrow, and the white face on the pillow had not moved. She had finished. The room had been silent. The Dowager had said, in a small voice that did not match her usual register, "Will you come, Miss Ashcombe, every evening, at the dusking hour, until—" The Dowager had not finished the sentence. She had not said, "Until what?" Aylwyn had answered, "Every evening, my lady." She had been 18. She had not understood what she had agreed to. She had simply agreed. Her father had been carried away in her 20th year by a winter fever that took him in 3 nights. 3 nights of fever, and a 4th at dawn that took him quietly. The Dowager had received Aylwyn in the small library afterward, and had offered her a stipend out of her own private estate to continue, and Aylwyn had accepted, because she had no family left, and because by then the white face on the pillow had become a face she knew. She had catalogued its small changes, the lengthening of his hair, the deepening of the hollow under the left cheekbone, the slow thickening of the dark stubble Mrs. Harrow's nephew shaved off twice a week. She had memorized the rise and fall of his breath, the way one memorizes the breathing of a sleeping child. She had not thought of him as a corpse. She had thought of him as a man who had wandered very far inside his own house, and could not, just now, find his way back to the front door. Her job, she had told herself, was to leave a candle burning in the window. The song was the candle. Now the candle had been answered. She sat up in the green chamber, drew her knees to her chest, and pressed her forehead into them. "What in heaven's name happens now?" she said aloud, to no one, in the empty room. The fire said nothing. The fire never had answers. She got up, because there was no possibility of further sleep, and crossed to the window of the green chamber and drew the curtain back perhaps an inch. The grey October dawn was just beginning at the eastern edge of the moor. The lawn below was silvered with frost. A single sheep had walked across the parterre during the night, presumably escaped from the home farm, and stood now at the foot of the south steps, as if waiting for instructions. The smoke of the kitchen chimneys was already going up. Mrs. Harrow had been at her ovens, evidently, since 4. Elowen stood at the window for some minutes and watched the dawn put pink along the underbellies of the long autumn clouds. And she thought, very simply, this is the morning of his first day. Then she dressed. She dressed without much regard in the russet wool she had worn the night before, because the trunk Mrs. Harrow had brought across to the Green Chamber had not yet been unpacked, and she did not wish to keep the Duke waiting. She drew her chestnut hair back into the same severe knot she had worn for 7 years, although her fingers shook so badly on the second pin that she had to begin again. She washed her face in cold water from the basin on the dressing stand. She tied the indigo cloak around her shoulders, although she would not be going outside, because she found she wanted the small additional weight of cloth across her collarbones. She pulled on her boots. She crossed the corridor to his bedchamber, paused outside the door for a count of 10, and knocked. Mrs. Harrow opened it. The housekeeper's eyes were red around the rims, but her wide, solid face was entirely composed. She looked at Elowen for a long moment, and then she stood aside, and Elowen went in. What happened in the next 4 days was that Julian Ravensford took small, careful steps back into the world of speech, and small, careful steps backward into the world of his own body. The household reorganized itself around him with the slow gravity of a wheel finding a new axle. Mrs. Harrow doubled the kitchen fires and tripled the calls upon the dairy, because Calder had instructed that broth must be available at any hour the Duke could be coaxed to swallow it. The night nurses, who for 7 years had divided the dark hours between them in the long gallery, were dismissed with a fortnight's wages and the dowager's careful thanks. Their cot was removed. The carpets were rolled out again over the floorboards beside the bed. The room itself slowly became a bedchamber once more, and not a sick room. Curtains that had hung half-drawn for years were tied back. A tall mahogany shaving stand was carried up from the Duke's old dressing room and reinstalled in its proper corner, and the dust that had collected on its mirrors was carefully sponged away. The smell of the room changed by degrees. Less of the bitter tincture, more of cut beech logs from the courtyard woodpile, more of the apples Mrs. Harrow set on the windowsill for their scent, and Elowen, who had spent 7 years cataloguing the smells of that bedchamber as faithfully as another woman might have catalogued a herb garden, observed each change without comment, and felt each one as a small private mercy. Elowen Ashcombe sat on the oak stool every dusk and sang, because he asked her to. And on the second morning he asked her to sing in the morning as well, and on the third morning he asked her to sing while he was sitting upright with 3 pillows behind him, eating thin chicken broth from a spoon held by Mrs. Harrow. And on the 4th morning he asked her to put down the song and tell him, simply, what she had been doing for the past 7 years besides this. "This is what I have been doing for the past 7 years," Elowen said. "Beyond this," he said. "Outside this room." "Outside this room," she said, considering. She had walked to the village twice a week to buy sheet music with the dowager's coin, and had written out copies of those scores by hand. She had taught the curate's 3 daughters their solfege on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She had read every book in his grandmother's library, beginning at the south wall and proceeding leftward, and was presently engaged with a German treatise on the cultivation of pears, which she did not entirely understand. "German pears," Julian said. He was watching her face with the same precision he had used on the first night, and his grey eyes were fractionally amused. "Do you intend to grow them?" "I intend," Elowen said gravely, "to die before I finish the chapter on grafting." He laughed. It was a small sound, half breath, half voice, and it appeared to surprise him as much as it surprised her. He raised one slow hand and pressed it flat against his own chest, as if he had not expected the laugh to come out of him, and was checking to see whether it had cost him anything. His grey eyes met hers over his fingers. He looked, for an instant, like a young man who had just discovered that one piece of him still worked. "Miss Ashcombe." "Your Grace." He had been informed by his grandmother, 3 times in 2 days, that she was to be addressed by her Christian name. He should like her permission, he said. Hers, not the dowager's. Eowyn kept her hands folded in her lap, because if she did not fold them, she did not entirely trust them. Eowyn, she said. Eowyn. He said it carefully, as if he were trying out a word in a foreign language. Then, with more confidence, Eowyn. Thank you. You knew it already. I knew it as a sound coming through a door. I am learning it as a name. Mrs. Harrow chose this moment to bring in a fresh basin of water, and the moment broke, and Eowyn rose to help her, and when she sat down again, Julian had closed his eyes and was breathing the slow, deliberate breath of a man husbanding strength. She did not sing. She watched his face. She had watched it for 7 years. It ought, by every reasonable rule, not to be different now that the eyes opened. It was different. It had become a face that could decide things. The difference was almost impossible to look at directly. She looked at her own hands instead. The door opened without a knock. Cassius Ravensford had come up to the bedchamber every day since his arrival, and on each of the previous 3 days he had been turned back at the door by Dr. Calder, or Mrs. Harrow, on the dowager's instruction. Today, evidently, he had decided to walk past whoever stood between him and his cousin. He was magnificently dressed. He was in a coat the colour of green moss, with cut steel buttons and a crevasse tied so precisely that it must have taken a London valet half an hour. He was smiling. Julian, he said. Not Your Grace, not cousin. Julian, the affectionate diminutive of the schoolroom, deployed with deliberate intimacy. My dear fellow, they have kept me from you long enough. Julian's eyes opened. The change in his face was immediate and unfeigned. The softness, what Eowyn had been about to allow herself to call softness, drained out of it. What replaced it was something Eowyn had never seen, because she had never seen Julian Ravensford face an enemy. It was attention. Cold, intelligent, completely awake attention, of the kind a swordsman gives to the man in front of him before the first salute. Cassius. You look better than I dared hope, cousin. I look like a man who has not stood unaided in 7 years, Julian said. His voice was hoarse but unhurried. Which is what I am. Sit down. Cassius sat. He sat in the chair Eowyn had vacated 4 days ago to stand for the dowager, the chair next to the bed, on the side opposite Eowyn's stool. He took up rather more of the chair than the chair had been built for. His hazel eyes flicked once at Eowyn, who was sitting very still on her stool, and a small private calculation passed across his face. Miss Ashcombe, he said, perhaps you might give us a quarter of an hour. Miss Ashcombe will stay, Julian said, before Eowyn could open her mouth. My dear Julian, family matters. Miss Ashcombe, said the Duke of Ravensford, with the quiet precision of a man who had spent 4 days teaching his vocal cords to deliver a sentence, and was proud of the result, has more right to sit in this room than any man living except myself. She will stay. There was a pause, in which Cassius's smile remained on his face by an act of will. As Julian wished, he replied. He had merely thought to spare her the tedium of estate matters. They had a great deal to discuss, the two of them. 4 years of stewardship, decisions taken in his absence, roofs put on the south barns, the river wall above the Wensleydale farms repaired. Repaired by whom? By the estate. By the estate's funds, you mean? Under whose authority? His, Cassius said. In Julian's name, with the dowager's countersignature on every disbursement of more than £50, as required by the trusteeship instrument their late great-uncle had drawn up against precisely this contingency. He had the ledgers, he said. He had always had the ledgers. He would be relieved to deliver them the moment Calder permitted Julian to read. I should like to see them today. Calder will not permit it. Calder is not in this room. Today is not wise. Cassius. Cassius's smile thinned at last. Yes, Julian. He had administered Ravensford for 4 years on the Dowager's countersignature, Julian observed. That afternoon he would deliver to the Dowager the keys to the steward's office, the tally books for the last 4 years, and the lease roll up to date. By the next day, Julian would sit up. By the day after, he would read. Within 2 weeks, he would know everything Cassius had done in his name. He suggested, mildly, that Cassius not, for the love he bore the family, be in a hurry to misrepresent any of it. Whatever had been done, Julian was prepared to forgive what was forgivable. He would not, however, forgive being made a liar. Cassius did not answer for several seconds. "Of course, Your Grace," he said at last. The "Your Grace" was new, and the chill in his voice was new, and the way he rose was new. He bowed. He went to the door. He paused at the door and turned, and looked at Aylwin for the briefest possible instant, and his smile came back. "Miss Ashcombe, walk with me a moment if you would. There is a matter regarding your father's estate I have neglected." "Miss Ashcombe will not walk with you," said Julian, "for any matter regarding any estate, this afternoon or any other afternoon. There is no matter regarding her father's estate. Mr. Ashcombe's affairs were settled by my grandmother in the spring of his daughter's 20th year, in writing, witnessed by Calder. If you have papers suggesting otherwise, you have papers I should like to see." Cassius did not produce papers. The door closed behind him, perhaps a fraction harder than it needed to. Julian's eyes slid to Aylwin's. He was, she noted with a curious, distant clarity, breathing as if he had run a quarter of a mile. "He has been alone with the books," he said quietly. 4 years, yes. You have observed him. For 4 years. Tell me what you have observed." Aylwin considered. She was a music master's daughter, not a steward. She had no head for figures. But she had eyes. She listed them. The new windows in the steward's wing, the 2 new horses in the eastern stable, neither broken to harness. A London tailor's bill that had come up in February and been paid out of estate funds because, Mrs. Harrow said, Cassius had told the Dowager it was for the boy livery. 3 tenants who had been turned off the land. The chapel roof that had not been mended. She paused. Julian's grey eyes had gone quite still. "That is not nothing," he said. "It is what I have seen, Your Grace. I am not Julian," he said. Aylwin stopped. While they were alone in this room, the Duke said, he would like to be Julian to her, as she was Aylwin to him. He had 7 years in which to remember the dignity of his title. He had only this afternoon in which to remember the dignity of his own name in a friend's mouth. Aylwin sat with her hands folded and her heart unaccountably loud, and said, very quietly, "Julian." "Thank you," he said. He closed his eyes. She sang to him then, because she did not know what else to do, and the song was not the river song this time, but a different one, a Yorkshire ballad about a man coming home, and on the 3rd verse he whispered, "I had forgotten this one," and on the 4th verse his hand found hers across the counterpane, and she did not move it. The first week became the second week, and the second week became the third, and Julian Ravensford recovered with the grim, methodical patience of a man who had once broken his arm at 14, and remembered the lessons of that recovery now twice over. He sat up. He stood the 3rd Tuesday, leaning on the bedpost, and breathing as if the air had become heavier in his absence. He took 6 steps the next morning, and fell on the 7th, and Aylwin, who had sprung up to catch him, was held at arm's length by his palm against her shoulder. "No," he said. "I will get up alone, or not at all." "Julian, you will hurt Aylwin." His grey eyes were fixed on the carpet where he intended to put his foot, and his jaw was set, and he was the picture of stubborn male recovery. "I have been carried for 7 years. I will not be carried in the 8th. Step back." She stepped back. He got up. The 7th step that day became 8 steps the day after, and 9 the day after that, and by the end of the 3rd week, he could cross his own bedchamber under his own power, and he was insufferable about it. Calder, who had no patience for sentiment in his patients, set up a regimen with the precision of a country bridge engineer measuring a span. Julian was to walk 3 times the length of the bedchamber in the morning, 4 times before the noon meal, and 5 times before dusk. The count was to be raised by 1 each day. The mahogany shaving stand and the foot of the bed were to serve as turn points. If Julian fell, he was to be assisted up but not lifted, and the count was to resume from the beginning. Elowen, who had not been consulted in the design of this regimen, but found herself somehow appointed its enforcer, sat on the oak stool with a small book of accounts she had started keeping for the dowager's stipend, and entered each day's count in a column at the back of the book in her round, schoolmistress hand. Julian, when he had finished his count for the morning and was breathing as if a horse had stepped on his chest, would lean against the mahogany shaving stand and watch her enter the figure, and would observe, with a forced and entirely unconvincing nonchalance, that he hoped she found his progress satisfactory. She generally did not give him the satisfaction of confirming it. By the middle of the 2nd week, he had moved out of the great bed into a small armchair set near the window, and from there to the long padded settle by the fire. By the end of the 2nd week, he had shaved himself, with a great deal of grumbling about the unsteadiness of his hands, and had then refused, on principle and rather childishly, to allow Mrs. Harrow's nephew anywhere near his throat with a razor for the rest of the season. He read newspapers. He read the Dowager's prayer book in the evenings, which startled both his grandmother and Elowen, although for different reasons. He read, twice, the small green-bound volume of Sheridan's plays that he had had brought up from the library on the 2nd Wednesday, and he laughed aloud, twice, in places Elowen could not have predicted. She came in once to hear him laughing in an empty room with a Sheridan open on his knee, and she stopped at the threshold, and she did not speak, and he looked up at her over the book with the small private smile of a man who has just remembered an old friend. Calder pronounced him, on the morning of the 18th day, to be doing better than any patient of his recollection had any business doing. The Dowager pronounced him, on the same evening, to be a great deal more himself than was, perhaps, comfortable for the rest of the household. Mrs. Harrow pronounced him, on no particular evening, but to anyone in the kitchen who would listen, to be his late father's image when he was 22, and could mind his manners about the broth, or be sent to bed without it. Elowen, who had no household standing from which to pronounce anything, observed in private that the Duke of Ravensford, in good health, was a person of considerable and slightly alarming presence, and that she was not entirely sure what to do with this information. "You walk," Elowen observed one afternoon, "like a colt born in a teapot." "That," Julian said, "is unkind." "It is accurate." "It is unkind and accurate. Did you sit at my bedside for 7 years to bully me when I woke?" "I sat at your bedside for 7 years," said Elowen, "because I was paid." He looked at her sharply. Then he saw her face. Then he laughed. The second laugh, less surprised this time, with more of his real voice in it, and said, "I see, we are now bantering." "It would appear so." "Where did you learn to do that? You did not banter when you were 18. "I taught myself, while you were unavailable to teach me. The library is large." "What did you read on the topic of bantering, may I ask?" "Sheridan. Most of Sheridan." "Sheridan," Julian said gravely. "I am to be repaid for 7 years' silence in Sheridan. Mercy, woman." He did not, he observed afterward, when he had time to observe such things, recall ever in his prior life having said the word woman to a person directly. The Sheridan had a great deal to answer for. It was that afternoon, the afternoon of the first true banter, that Mrs. Harrow brought up the post on a small silver tray, and there was, at the top of the post, a letter addressed to His Grace the Duke of Ravensford, in a crabbed legal hand that Elowen recognized at once as belonging to Mr. Pellow, the family solicitor in York. Julian opened it. He read it once. He read it twice. His face did not change, but Elowen, who had spent 7 years studying his face for the smallest signal, saw the small thing that happened to his jaw. Cassius has filed, Julian said, for an inquiry into my competence. Aylwin put down her sewing. Julian explained, in his quiet, hoarse voice, what Cassius had done. He had gone to the Court of Chancery in London and presented a sworn affidavit that the man who awoke from 7 years' sleep was not, in any meaningful sense, the man who had gone to sleep, that his reasoning was impaired, that his judgment was unfit, that he was open to the influence of any party near him, but his decisions in the past 3 weeks regarding the estate were voidable, that a guardianship of his person and estates was required, and that Cassius, as the next mill of the line, was the obvious party to undertake it. Aylwin's hands, in her lap, had gone very still. "He must produce witnesses, must he not?" she said. He would, Julian said. He had named 3 already. One was a London doctor who had not seen Julian. One was the curate of their parish, who Julian did not believe had crossed the threshold of the house in 5 years. The third... He stopped. "The third," he said, "is Miss Price." "Miss Price," said Aylwin carefully, "is one of the upper chambermaids." "Yes." "Who has been at the hall for 2.5 years?" "Yes." "Whom your cousin engaged personally on his last visit?" "Yes," said Julian. "Whom my cousin engaged personally." He set the letter on the counterpane and laid his palm flat upon it. And who would, he imagined, be prepared to swear in court that during the past 3 weeks she had observed him to be confused, agitated, suggestible, and entirely under the influence of an unmarried woman of dubious origin, who had spent 7 years occupying an unpaid position in the bedchamber of an unconscious peer. Aylwin did not move. That, Julian said, was the suggestion Cassius would make, and his voice was now not hoarse at all, and not weak. It was the voice of a man who had remembered exactly who he was. Cassius would say that his first words upon waking had been a request to be sung to, that he could not bear to have her leave the room, that he had addressed her by her Christian name in front of staff, that he had refused to discuss estate matters without her present, that, by Cassius's account, he could not be left without her. "And you are, in fact, doing none of those things." "I am doing all of those things, Aylwin. We both know it." The silence in the bedchamber was the kind of silence that has a temperature. "Then I must withdraw," Aylwin said very quietly. "From this room. From this house. I should never have—" "You will not withdraw." "Julian, listen." She would not withdraw, he told her. The moment she withdrew, his cousin's case became the truth. Not the appearance of the truth. The truth. Cassius would say Julian had gone mad without her, and he would be correct, because what Cassius was doing was calculated to drive him mad. She would stay, Julian said, and they would fight this, and they would win it. And they would not win it by being meek about it. "Julian, and," he said, with a small, grim smile, "you will sing to me through every minute of it, because if I am to face the Court of Chancery in a fortnight, I shall need the river to keep finding the sea." He held out his hand, palm up, on the counterpane. After a long moment, Aylwin put hers into it. The Dowager said, when she had read the letter, "He has dared more than I supposed him capable of daring. Very well. We shall be obliged to teach him the correct measure of his daring." Dr. Calder, when he had read the letter, gave his verdict bluntly. Cassius could not win. He had not the medical evidence. But he could drag the matter through 3 months of public hearings and humiliate Miss Ashcombe in newspapers from Edinburgh to Bath. They would have to go to London, he told the Duke, sooner than he should like. Mrs. Harrow, when she heard of the letter from the kitchen maid, who had it from the under footman, who had it from Lady Vivian's lady's maid, declared with vehement civility that if that snake-faced man came back into her kitchen for so much as a pot of tea, he would find it boiling on his lap, with her apologies to the rug. Pudding said nothing, because Pudding was the Dowager's elderly dachshund, who had outlived 3 husbands of acquaintances and slept by the library fire on a silk cushion shaped like a pear. But Pudding waddled up to Aylwin on the morning of their departure for London, looked up at her with the watery dignity of his species, and laid his small grey muzzle on her boot, and Eowyn, who had not wept since the second night, knelt down and put her face into the warm, coarse fur of his back, and wept for perhaps 2 minutes, and then stood up and put on her gloves and got into the carriage. The dowager, already inside, observed her without comment for half a mile. Then the dowager said, "He proposed at 6 this morning." Eowyn turned her head so quickly she felt a small pain in her neck. "My lady." To her, the dowager said, not to Eowyn, she clarified. Julian had had her roused at 6 and informed her that as soon as the inquiry was disposed of, and his strength permitted, he intended to ask Eowyn to marry him. He had wished his grandmother to know it before any other party, and had wished her to refrain, these were his words, from mentioning the matter to Eowyn on any account, which was, the dowager added dryly, why she was mentioning it to her on this account. He had also requested her blessing. The carriage rolled on. Eowyn's voice, when it came, was small. "Did you give it?" "Of course I gave it." The dowager looked out of the window for some time. Then she said, in a different voice, a smaller, older voice that Eowyn had never heard her use before. She had lived in that house for 51 years, the dowager said. She had buried 2 husbands, and a son and a daughter-in-law. In all those years, there had been one sound in that house that made her believe a thing might come right, and it had been Eowyn's singing. So when Eowyn married her grandson, if she chose to, she would be marrying a man who had learned to listen to her before he had learned to look at her. There were, the dowager observed, worse foundations for a marriage. Eowyn looked at her hands. "Lady Vivian," she said, "I have not said that I would. He has not asked." He would ask, the dowager said, properly, not from his bed. He would ask after he had stood in the court of chancery and put her great-nephew in his place, and not before. He had informed her of this also. The dowager smiled, faintly, into the carriage curtain. It would seem, she observed, that after 7 years of stillness, her grandson had come back to himself rather pointedly. The carriage rolled on, into autumn, into the mud-thick roads south, into London. The journey south to London took 4 days in the dowager's old travelling carriage. The carriage had a green leather interior, brass fittings polished to the soft glow of long use, and a foot-warmer lined with copper, which Mrs. Harrow had filled fresh with hot embers at every change of horses. The roads were thick with autumn rain. The hedgerows along the Great North Road were heavy with red haws and the last black sloes. Smoke rose from village chimneys in the still, wet air. In the towns where they stopped, Doncaster, Newark, Stamford, Biggleswade, the inn-yards were loud with the bustle of stagecoaches running before the worst of the season closed the roads altogether. Eowyn, who had not slept on a coaching-inn bed since she was 18, slept badly on each of them, and made up the deficit by dozing for an hour each afternoon against the green leather, while the dowager read her prayer book and Pudding snored on the opposite seat. Julian had been forbidden by Calder to make the journey on horseback, which had been his first proposal. He had compromised by riding outside the carriage on the box for an hour each morning while the air was thin and the road was clear, and by sitting inside it the rest of the day, with his eyes politely closed whenever Eowyn wished to feign sleep. He carried a book of Sheridan's plays in his coat pocket, which he did not open. Eowyn pretended not to notice this. The dowager, whose powers of observation had been honed by 72 winters, observed everything and remarked upon nothing. London opened around them like a wet book. The hearing was scheduled for the 2nd Tuesday of November in the Court of Chancery, before Master Whitfield, in a small, dark, wood-panelled room in Lincoln's Inn that smelled of pipe smoke and damp wool. Cassius's counsel was a Mr. Henschel, a thin man with a nose like a Roman general and a habit of pressing his fingertips together as if they were instruments of measurement. Julian's counsel was Mr. Pellow himself, the family solicitor, brought up from York, who had not appeared in a London court in 11 years and was visibly uneasy about it. The Dowager said, the night before the hearing, "Pello is a good man. He is not the right man. We are going to require additional counsel." "There is no time," said Dr. Calder. "There is time," said the Dowager Ravensford, "for a woman who has a goddaughter married to the Lord Chancellor's nephew." There was, as it turned out, time. The additional counsel was Mr. Levitt, a King's Counsel of approximately 50, who arrived at the small townhouse the Dowager had taken in Bedford Square at 9 o'clock the night before the hearing. He ate a cold supper at the Dowager's table, listened to the case for 40 minutes, and asked 4 questions. He would take the matter, he announced. He required Miss Ashcombe to breakfast with him at 7, that he might know her voice as she would use it in court. He required Dr. Calder to present him with the medical record before breakfast. He required Lady Vivian to refrain, with all respect, from her customary directness in the witness box. He inquired, dryly, whether he might have these things. "You may," said the Dowager. "Then I believe we have a contest, Your Grace. Not a defence, a contest. There is a distinction, and we shall observe it." He bowed and went. Julian, who had not spoken much in the journey down, he was managing his strength with the discipline of a soldier rationing powder, looked at his grandmother across the dining room table. "Granny." "Yes, my dear." "You have been conducting this campaign without informing me of every flank." "I am 72, Julian. You have a great deal to learn from me before I die. We had best begin with the Lord Chancellor's nephew's wife, and proceed at our own speed." He laughed. It was, Aylwin reflected, as she lay in the strange London bed that night, listening to the rain on the unfamiliar London roof, the 3rd time since she had known him that Julian Ravensford had laughed in her hearing. 2 of the 3 had been at his grandmother. She tried to commit the count to memory. She could not sleep. At 1:15, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Slow, deliberate, the careful footsteps of a man who had been on his feet now for half an hour and was paying for every step. They paused outside her door. They did not knock. After a moment, they passed on toward the staircase. Aylwin lay still for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she got up, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders over her nightgown, opened her door without sound, and went after him. She caught him at the head of the stairs, leaning on the banister, breathing as if the banister were the only thing in the world keeping him upright. He turned his head when he heard her bare feet on the floorboards. "You should be asleep," he said. "You should be in bed." "I cannot sleep." "Neither can I." They considered each other in the watery half-light of the single oil lamp the housekeeper had left burning at the turn of the stairs. He was in a black silk dressing gown over his nightclothes. His dark hair was tousled with the particular disarray of a head that has been on a pillow without rest, and he looked tired, in a way that made Aylwin's chest hurt. "Sit," she said. There was a small upholstered bench at the head of the stairs, a window seat with a velvet cushion. They sat. He sat heavily, she sat lightly. Their shoulders touched. She did not move hers, and after a moment, he did not move his. "I have a confession," he said. "What?" "I am terrified of tomorrow." "So am I." "I am terrified," he said. "Not because I might lose. I am terrified because if I lose you." "You would not lose me, Julian." He laid out, in a quiet voice, what stood to be lost. Cassius would have him declared incompetent by the close of business the following afternoon, and removed from the management of his own affairs. He would be made a ward of his cousin's guardianship. The first thing Cassius would do, the very first thing, would be to have her removed from the house as an undue influence. There would be a footman at the bedchamber door. The Dowager would be represented as suggestible. Julian himself would be put in a quiet room in the country, with a London doctor Cassius kept in his pocket, visited as little as the law required, and his houses and coalfields and coke furnaces and London ground rents would slide, by careful degrees, into Cassius's hand. And Aylwin would receive a letter from a solicitor, informing her that her services were no longer required. That, he said, was what he stood to lose. His voice was not loud. It did not have to be. Julian. Yes. He will not win. No. He will not win because we will not let him. Because your grandmother will not let him. Because Mr. Levitt will not let him. Because She stopped, because she had not meant to begin a sentence she did not know how to end. He waited. Because I will not let him, she said. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he reached very slowly for her hand and turned it over in his and ran the pad of his thumb across the calluses on the inside of her fingertips. The calluses she had got from copying scores by hand for 7 years. He had not earned the right yet, he said quietly. The next day he would earn it. Then he would ask her a question. He asked whether she would do him the kindness of not answering it tonight, before he had earned the right to ask. I will do you that kindness. Thank you. Julian? Yes. You have been awake 1 month. Yes. I have known you, in the sense in which a person knows a person, for 1 month. She had known him, he said, for 10 years before that. Differently, through a wall, one might say. And he had known her for 7 of those years, differently, through a wall also. They had been on opposite sides of a wall for a very long time, the two of them, and the wall had only just come down. He was aware of the asymmetry. He was aware that he had woken, and the world had woken with him, and she had not had any of these months to consider whether she wished him in them. The question he would ask in the morning, when he asked it, would be a question, he said, not an expectation. He asked her if she understood the distinction. I understand. Then go to bed, Eilwen Ashcombe. She rose. So did he, though slower. She turned toward the corridor that led to her chamber. He turned toward his. She paused. Julian? Yes. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, I have not regretted 7 years. I want you to know that before the morning. She did not wait to see his face. She walked to her chamber, closed the door, leaned her forehead against the wood, and only then did she let her shoulders shake. Mr. Henschel, on behalf of Mr. Cassius Ravensford, opened the case in the Court of Chancery on Tuesday morning by laying out, in tones of measured concern, the medical and circumstantial grounds on which his client wished to assume the guardianship of his cousin's person and estates. He spoke for 40 minutes. He invoked the eminent London physician. He referenced the curate. He referred, discreetly, with averted eyes, to the question of irregular feminine attendance over a period of years. He suggested that the Duke's affections had been cultivated, in the way creeping ivy cultivates the wall that eventually pulls down. He sat down with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had laid his foundation well. Mr. Levitt rose. Mr. Levitt did not, at first, speak. He looked at Master Whitfield. He looked at the bench. He looked at Mr. Henschel, who had taken his seat. He looked, finally, at his own client, the Duke of Ravensford, who was sitting in a wooden chair set discreetly to one side of the chamber, dressed in a coat the colour of pewter with silver buttons, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his grey eyes steady, his face thinner than it ought to have been, but in no other respect remarkable. Then Mr. Levitt began. He observed, pleasantly, that his learned friend had presented a great many things, and that he found himself uncertain which of them constituted the case before the court. If the case was medical incompetence, they would examine Dr. Calder, who had been the Duke's physician for 16 years, and would attend the court that day. If the case was undue influence within the household, they would examine the household, the housekeeper of 32 years' service, the Dowager Lady Vivian, who had been at Ravensford for 51. If the case was that an unmarried woman, who had sat 7 years at the bedside of an unconscious peer, was, by that fact alone, a creature of opportunity, then he confessed he looked forward to that part of the case extremely. Indeed, he had prepared for it. Master Whitfield, on the bench, who had been a young barrister himself 30 years ago and remembered the trade, allowed himself the smallest movement of his eyebrows. The matter before the court, Mr. Levitt went on, turning now directly toward the bench, had been presented as a question of medical capacity. It was not. It was a question of access to a great fortune. The petitioner was the Duke's male cousin. The petitioner had, for 4 years, administered the Duke's estate under the Dowager's countersignature. The petitioner had had every reasonable expectation, 3 calendar months ago, that he would inherit. The Duke had woken. The petitioner had filed. Those were the facts. The medical evidence was a costume worn over them. With Master Whitfield's permission, Mr. Levitt would now proceed to remove the costume. He then proceeded, over the course of the morning, to do precisely that. He called Dr. Calder, who described in 20 unhurried minutes the precise medical condition of the Duke at the moment of injury, at intervals during the 7 years, and at the present time. He produced charts. He produced the Duke's recorded weights, pulse rates, breath counts. He testified that the Duke's reasoning, on examination, was as it had been at 21. Slower at retrieving recent vocabulary, no slower in argument. He called Mrs. Harrow, who informed the court, with the comfortable severity of a woman who had run a great kitchen for 3 decades, that Mr. Cassius Ravensford had visited his sleeping cousin in 7 years, a total of 9 times, that Miss Ashcombe had visited the same cousin every dusk of every day, except for one period of 3 weeks in her 20th year, when her father lay in his final illness, and that anyone in the house who had eyes could tell which of the two was the relation of opportunity. He called the Dowager, who did not raise her voice once and did not need to. And then, at the close of the morning, he called Miss Elowen Ashcombe. Elowen rose. She had dressed carefully that morning. She had not dressed in mourning, because she was not in mourning. She had not dressed in finery, because she had no finery. She had dressed in a gown of plain, dark indigo wool. It had been the Dowager's gift, made by a London modiste in 3 days to Mr. Levitt's specifications, with white linen at the throat and at the wrists, and her chestnut hair was drawn smoothly back, and her grey-green eyes were entirely steady. She was 25 years old, and she walked from her seat to the witness stand, and she swore upon the Bible to tell the truth, and she sat down and folded her hands. Mr. Levitt began, as he had warned her he would, with the quiet boilerplate of identification. Name, age, parish of birth, the date of her father's first appointment to Ravensford Hall, and Elowen answered each in turn, her voice a little smaller than she had hoped, but level. "How long have you known the Duke, Miss Ashcombe?" "Personally since my 18th year, sir. By name in my father's household since I was a child of 7. "And how often have you attended at the Duke's bedside in his illness?" "Every evening at dusk, sir, with the exception of 3 weeks in my 20th year, when my own father lay in his last illness." The courtroom was very still as she answered. Master Whitfield was watching her over the silver rims of his spectacles. Mr. Henschel was making, with great care, a small note on the foolscap before him. The Dowager, in the front row, kept her gloved hands precisely folded over the head of her cane. Julian, in his chair to one side, did not look at Elowen at all. He had told her, the previous night in the small parlour at Bedford Square, that he intended not to look at her in court, except when she looked at him, because it was important to Mr. Levitt's case that her testimony should appear to belong to her, and not to the man it concerned. She found, after the first 3 minutes, that she did not need him to look at her. She could feel his attention, even through the back of his head. "And what did you do at his bedside, Miss Ashcombe?" "I sang to him." "Why?" "Because," she said, her father had told her his ear would receive a song where it would not receive speech. Because the Dowager Lady Vivian had asked her to. Because at first she had done it for them, and because afterwards she had done it for him. "Miss Ashcombe, were you paid for this attendance?" "After my father's death, yes. The Dowager paid me a stipend out of her widow's portion. £40 the year, with my keep." Mr. Levitt let the figure rest for a moment in the air of the courtroom, before he repeated it back to her, very gently, as if confirming a number on a tradesman's bill. £40, the year, for 7 years' nightly attendance on a sleeping man. Elwyn confirmed it. She heard, distantly, a small sound from one of the newspaper men along the back bench that might have been a low whistle, or might have been a cough. Mr. Henschel's hand paused for a fraction of a second above his foolscap, and then continued. "Did you understand this?" Mr. Levitt asked, in the same quiet voice. "To be a sufficient sum?" Elwyn considered. She had not, in 7 years, considered the question. She had understood it, she replied, to be a kindness, Your Grace. She had no other family. The Dowager had kept her in the house. The sum had been generous, given that she had no expectation of marriage and no other prospect. "And had you, Miss Ashcombe, any expectation that the Duke would wake?" "My lord," she said, and her grey-green eyes lifted to Master Whitfield's at last. She had had hope, but she had not had expectation. She had been told for 7 years by competent physicians that he would not return to himself. She had been told by the Dowager to sing as if he might, and she had sung as if he might. When she had sung, she had not sung as a person who expected reward. She had sung as a person who had been asked to do a kind thing, for a household that had taken her in when she had no other place. She had sung as if her father was standing behind her shoulder, because he had asked her to, and he was no longer with them. She was not sure, she said, what other answer his lordship wished. There was a small silence in the court. Mr. Henschel, on the other bench, rose and bowed and asked permission to cross-examine. He was given permission. He came forward with his fingertips pressed together. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "on the night the Duke awoke, what were his first words to you?" Elwyn had been told this question would come. She had been told, by Mr. Levitt, to answer it plainly. "He said, sir, never stop." "Never stop, Mr. Ashcombe," Henschel repeated, with a small private smile. "And what did you understand him to mean, Miss Ashcombe?" "I understood him to mean," Elwyn said, "that he wished me to continue singing. I had been singing the verse about the river meeting the sea. I was on the 3rd line." "You did not understand him to be making a declaration?" "I did not, sir. He was 12 seconds awake. He could barely swallow. He could not have been making a declaration." "And in the weeks since?" "In the weeks since," she said, "His Grace and she had spoken at length, and she would not pretend in this court that she had not come to know him. She had come to know him. She had known him, in some small way, when his eyes were closed. She knew him better with them open. He was more like himself than he had been. But the thing Mr. Henschel was really asking, and here her chin came up, very slightly, was whether she had profited from the Duke's confusion. The answer, she said, was no. The Duke had not been confused. The Duke had been awake and lucid, and the man her father once taught Italian. And she had been what she was before, a woman who was paid, and was no longer paid, to sing in his bedchamber. She was leaving Ravensford Hall, she added, at the end of this hearing. She had no intention of remaining in the Duke's house under any disposition of this court, except the one that returned him fully to his own keys. She had hoped that would not be a matter requiring her testimony. It would seem it was. Julian, in his chair to the side, did not move, but Mr. Levitt, at the bench, glanced sharply at his client, and Elwyn saw, out of the corner of her eye, the Duke of Ravensford's grey eyes close briefly, and his jaw set. She had not told him she was leaving. She had decided it the night before, on the window seat at the head of the stairs. She had not yet decided it for him. Mr. Henschel, who had not been expecting this answer, paused. He pressed her, because he had no other line left to press. Did she intend to leave the Duke's establishment then? She did, she replied, at the close of this hearing. Her father's small cottage in the Wensleydale, which she had not seen in 7 years, was waiting for her. She would take up residence there. She would give music lessons in the village. The Dowager had assured her of continuing friendship, and a small annuity in respect of her father's services, and she would require none of the Duke's assistance, and would, she thought, request none. Mr. Henschel, growing visibly desperate, attempted to characterize this as a renunciation. She cut him off without raising her voice. "I make no claim, sir. I have never made a claim. I sang because I was asked. I leave because I was never engaged for any other purpose." She sat very still in the witness chair, her hands folded, her chin level, her grey-green eyes on the wall just above Mr. Henschel's left shoulder, and her voice did not waver. Mr. Henschel, evidently feeling that his case had been somehow inverted in the past 2 minutes, tried for a moment to retrieve it. "And yet, Miss Ashcombe, you have addressed the Duke by his Christian name in front of his servants." At his request, she replied, with the Dowager's knowledge. The Duke, having endured the politeness of 7 years, might be permitted the informalities of 1 month. If his lordship required her to address him otherwise hereafter, she would obey. He had not been in a position to order it of her, and she had not given it without his asking. "And the late nights at his bedside?" "In the company," she replied, "of Mrs. Harrow, of Dr. Calder, of the Dowager Lady Vivian, of any combination of 3 of them at any given time." She asked evenly whether Mr. Henschel was suggesting she had been alone with the Duke without the household's knowledge. "I am suggesting, then suggest it plainly, sir, that I may answer it plainly." Master Whitfield, on the bench, said quietly, "Mr. Henschel, sit down." Mr. Henschel sat down. Master Whitfield looked at Elwyn for a long moment. Then he looked at Julian. Then he excused Miss Ashcombe from the witness box and adjourned the court to consider its disposition. He directed Mr. Levitt and Mr. Henschel to attend him in chambers. His eyes moved to Julian, and he indicated, courteously, that he should like, if his Grace was willing, to address one question to him privately before he ruled, and asked whether the Duke would remain in court. "I will remain, my lord," said Julian. The court rose. Elwyn left the witness stand. The Dowager met her at the rail with a small, dry hand on her elbow, and the Dowager said only, "Steady, child. Walk with me." And they went out together into the corridor and stood for 10 minutes by a tall, narrow window that looked out onto a wet, brown courtyard. The Dowager did not speak. Elwyn did not weep. After 10 minutes, an usher came to fetch them. When they returned to the chamber, Master Whitfield was already on the bench. Mr. Levitt was on his feet. Mr. Henschel was very still in his seat. Cassius Ravensford was, Elwyn saw with one quick glance, a different shade of pale than he had been an hour before. "Mr. Cassius Ravensford," Master Whitfield said. "Stand." Cassius stood. He had considered the petition brought to this court, he said. He had considered the medical evidence. He had considered the testimony of the household. He had considered at some length the testimony of Miss Ashcombe. He had spoken with the Duke. He paused. He found, he announced, no medical or circumstantial basis for a guardianship. The petition was dismissed. The Duke was competent. The estate was, and remained, in his hand. He would not enter into the further matter of stewardship and the 4 years' ledgers in this court, that being a matter between the Duke and the Court of Common Pleas, should he choose to bring it. He would, however, remark, and would do so on the record, that this petition appeared to him to have been brought in considerable bad faith. Costs were awarded against the petitioner, and they would be considerable. Mr. Peller was instructed to prepare a schedule. The petitioner had 30 days to settle. Court was dismissed. Mr. Henschel closed his folio. Cassius Ravensford did not move for several seconds. Then he turned, very slowly, and looked at his cousin. Julian Ravensford had risen, slowly, leaning briefly on Mr. Levitt's arm, and then standing free. He was, Elwyn noted with the trained eye of 7 years, breathing quite calmly. He was the picture of a man who had spent the morning watching another man lose. He did not gloat. He did not smile. He met his cousin's eyes for perhaps 4 seconds, and then, without saying a word, he turned and his grey gaze found Elwyn's, and he inclined his head in a gesture so small it was almost a private thing between them. It said, "I am still here." Aylwin, against every rule of court and decorum, smiled at him. The journey back to Bedford Square was made in 2 carriages. The Dowager, Mr. Levitt, and Dr. Calder went in one. Julian and Aylwin, by the Dowager's transparent contrivance, went in the other, accompanied, with no choice in the matter, by the Dowager's elderly dachshund, Pudding, who arranged himself across Aylwin's lap in the manner of a small grey shawl and immediately fell asleep. The carriage was quiet for the first turning of the wheels. Then Julian said, "You did not tell me you were leaving." "I did not know I was leaving until I said so." "You said so under oath." "I am aware." "Did you decide before the witness stand or upon it? On the window seat at the head of the stairs last night? Or before that?" "I think I had decided before, and I did not have the words for it until the moment Mr. Henshaw asked." "Ah." The carriage turned out of Lincoln's Inn and into Holborn, and the rain, which had been threatening all morning, began at last in soft, fat drops against the carriage roof. Pudding stirred and resettled. Aylwin kept her hands very still on his back, because if she did not keep her hands very still, she did not know what they would do. "Julian." "Yes." "You said you would ask me a question when you had earned the right." "I did." "Have you earned the right?" "By the reckoning of any sensible court, today, yes. By my own reckoning. Aylwin, I'm not sure that was the right I most needed to earn. I think there is another." "And what is the other?" "The right," he said, "to be considered as a man on his own merits, rather than as the sleeper she had sung awake." He had been the sleeper to her for 7 years. He should not like to ask her a question if it could be answered out of duty to a man who used to be unconscious. He should like to be answered, if he was answered, by a woman who had known him waking, and considered him waking, and decided whether she liked the man who was awake. "You are aware," Aylwin said carefully, "that I am about to leave for the Wensleydale." "I am aware." "And that I shall not see you for some months." "I shall write." "You shall write." "Every week." "Every week." He would ask her nothing in those letters, he said, beyond what she wished to answer. He would report on Pudding, and the South Barns, and the chapel roof, and the Yorkshire weather. He would not court her on paper. He would not, on paper, attempt the trick that had been performed upon her for years already. The trick of being a voice without a body. She had had quite enough of voices without bodies. So, he would write, and she would answer, or not answer, at her discretion. And in the spring, when the lambs were born and the river thawed, and she was eating green-edged hedgerows for breakfast, he would come and ask her his question, and she would give him the answer she had rehearsed from the front of her face all winter. The carriage had reached Bedford Square. Pudding stretched on Aylwin's lap and yawned and revealed his small, disgraceful pink tongue. "Julian." "Yes?" "That is a great deal of waiting on your part." "I have waited," said the Duke of Ravensford, "for 7 years already. 5 months will not signify." "You did not know you were waiting those 7 years." He looked at her then. The carriage had stopped. The footman was at the door. The rain was steady on the roof. He looked at her with the precision of a man who had thought about this answer for some time. And he said, "Did I not?" He stepped down. He turned and offered his hand. She took it. She came down out of the carriage, and Pudding came out behind her with the offended dignity of a small dog inconvenienced by weather. And the Dowager, who had come down out of her own carriage some moments earlier and was watching this disembarkation with an expression of the most studied neutrality, said only, "Inside, both of you. Mr. Levitt has won us a case, and is no doubt expecting his sherry." Mr. Levitt got his sherry. Cassius Ravensford did not appear at the townhouse, and was not expected to. That night, Aylwin sat with the Dowager for an hour in the small parlour at the back of the Bedford Square house, and they did not speak much. The dowager occupied her ladyship's customary chair near the fire, with pudding heavy on her lap and her embroidery hoop balanced on the arm of the chair, and Elowyn sat opposite her on a low stool, and the long-cased clock in the corner ticked patiently through the small, dark hours of a London evening that smelt of coal smoke and wet street, and, very faintly, of the lavender the dowager kept in a sachet in the linen press. The dowager did not lecture. She did not advise. She did not, even, look directly at Elowyn, except once, near the end of the hour, to say, gently, "5 months will pass, child. They always do." Then she tapped Pudding's small, hard skull with a finger, and Pudding rolled onto his back, and the dowager went on with her embroidery, and Elowyn, after a long while, went up to her room and packed her trunk for Yorkshire. She packed it carefully. The plain indigo gown went in first, folded around the silver-backed hairbrush that had been her mother's, 2 muslin morning dresses next, of which one was nearly new and one nearly past mending. A small pile of books, 2 volumes of Sheridan, the Yorkshire ballad book her father had compiled, a German treatise on the cultivation of pears she had not finished and was determined to, a small leather case of needlework, the dowager's gift, an enamel locket on a thin gold chain, which she had not yet had courage enough to wear, and which she set on the top of the linen. She had not packed it for 7 years. She found, when she had finished, that there was a great deal of room left in the trunk that there had not been in her trunk at 18. The next morning, Elowyn took the early stage north. She did not look out of the window, because if she had, she might not have gone. The Wensleydale cottage had 3 rooms and a low slate roof, and a chimney that had not been swept in 6 years, and a garden that had reverted entirely to nettles. Its walls were of the local pale grey stone, set with lime mortar, gone soft in places where the rain had worked at it. Its windows, 3 small ones to the south, 1 larger to the east, were latticed with leaded panes, of which several had been broken by jackdaws and stuffed haphazardly with a rag of sacking the previous tenant had pushed into the gap. Inside, the kitchen had a flagstone floor, scrubbed pale by half a century of country boots, and a great open hearth, half blackened by soot, and an oak settle with a faded green cushion on which a mouse had recently confined itself. The parlour had a small inlaid table that had been her mother's, and a faded watercolour of the Dale done by her father in his courting year. The back chamber, where she had slept as a child, had a narrow iron bedstead, a press for linen, and a single uncurtained window through which, at first light, the green hill behind the cottage came in flat and undeniable, like a held note. The cottage smelled of cold stone, of mice, of the previous tenant's pipe tobacco, and very faintly, under all the others, of wood smoke and the lavender her father had grown along the south wall, and which had reseeded itself among the nettles. Elowyn Ashcombe spent the first 3 days cleaning, the next 4 days repairing, and the next 3 weeks, once a glazier had been induced from the village to come and replace the cracked panes, writing. She wrote a great many letters. Most of them were burnt in the kitchen fire. Some of them were sent. Of those, 1 in 3 was sent to Ravensford Hall. The letters from Ravensford Hall, on the contrary, came every Tuesday. They were exactly as he had promised. They reported on Pudding, who had developed an unaccountable preference for sleeping on the Duke's left foot and would not be moved by any argument less than a kipper. They reported on the South Barns, whose roof was being mended by a man called Thwaites, whom Mrs. Harrow approved of. They reported on the chapel roof, on which work would commence in March. They reported, in a brief paragraph that Elowyn read twice, that the 3 tenants Cassius had turned off the land had been written to at their new addresses, offered the return of their old holdings on the original terms and, in 2 cases of 3, had accepted. The third, an elderly widower, had asked instead for a small cottage near his married daughter, and was being given it. They reported on the 4-year ledgers, which had been examined, which had revealed exactly what they had been expected to reveal, and on which the Duke had, with his solicitor's advice, declined to pursue further legal action against his cousin, in exchange for the cousin's signed undertaking to leave the kingdom. Cassius Ravensford had taken passage to Halifax. The letter mentioning this fact noted, in a separate paragraph, that the Dowager had ordered the windows in the steward's wing to be replaced on her own account, that the matter might be considered closed. The letters reported on the weather. They did not court her. They did not, however, conceal that their writer would be glad of an answer. Elowyn answered, mostly. Sometimes she did not. She wrote about the cottage, about the goat she had acquired. The goat was called, with more wit than charity, Mr. Henshaw. About the curate's daughters, whom she now taught Tuesdays and Thursdays, as before. She wrote about the long Yorkshire dusks. She did not write about him. She thought about him, every dusk, as the light drew down behind the moor and the kettle boiled on the hob. She sang, sometimes, while she worked, the river and sea song her mother had used, and she did not need to ask herself why. The Wensleydale winter folded itself around her, with the patient hostility of a winter that has been doing the same thing in the same dale for 1,000 years. Snow came on the 2nd of December, and did not properly leave until February. The road to the village was passable on 3 days in 5, and entirely impassable on the rest. The curate's 3 daughters arrived for their Tuesday lessons in patterns with wet stockings, sang their solfege through chattering teeth in front of Elowyn's hearth, and were sent home with hot bread and a stern note to their mother to keep them indoors on Thursdays. Mr. Henshaw, the goat, newly acquired from a farmer in the next village in exchange for the mending of a torn shirt and 3 afternoons of music for his daughter, proved, on closer acquaintance, to be a creature of strong views and stronger appetites. He ate the small plot of winter cabbages Elowyn had hopefully planted in October. He ate the apron she had hung on the garden wall to dry. And on the morning of Christmas Eve, he ate a corner of the Dowager's last letter, where Elowyn had carelessly left it on the kitchen settle. Elowyn, who had not lived alone in her life, her father had been with her until 20, the Dowager and Mrs. Harrow after that, and the great house always within doors, discovered slowly that solitude was a thing that had to be learned, and that she had a small, natural aptitude for it. She woke early. She lit her own fire. She walked, on every clear morning, up the green hill behind the cottage, and stood for a while on the broken stone wall, and looked out across the dale, and the quiet of the dale entered her bones like a slow tide. She read a great deal. She wrote, in a small, leather-bound book she had bought in Hawes for 6pence, a daily account of the weather, the goat's misdeeds, and the curate's daughter's progress on the descending chromatic scale. She did not write, in the small, leather-bound book, anything about the Duke of Ravensford. She thought, when she set the pen down each evening, that there was something faintly cowardly about this. She did not, on reflection, mind being a coward in this one thing. In late February, the post brought a letter that was thicker than usual. Inside was a smaller envelope, addressed in a hand she recognized immediately. Small, neat, deliberately patient, and a single sheet that read, "I am told that the Wensleydale roads will be passable from the 2nd week of April. May I come and walk with you? I will bring no question. I will bring my boots. J." She wrote back, "Bring the boots." She did not say the rest of it, because she did not need to. She thought he would understand. She put the letter into the post, and walked up the hill behind her cottage, and stood in the wind and laughed, once, sharply, like a woman discovering she had been carrying a stone in her pocket for months, and could finally set it down. Then she went home, and she put more wood on the fire, and she began, for the first time since she was 18, to consider what dress she might be wearing when next he saw her. He came on the 11th of April. The lambs were 3 weeks old. The blackthorn was in full white blossom along the lane, and the green-edged hedgerows the Dowager had teased about in the carriage were exactly as predicted. Mr. Henshaw the goat had taken up a position on top of the garden wall and was observing the road with the malevolent intelligence of his species. Pudding, who had, against Mrs. Harrow's strong advice, been brought along, was walking on a long red lead and was, every 6 steps, sitting down in protest at the mud. Julian was dressed in country tweeds, a dark green coat, brown breeches, and the boots he had promised. He had put on perhaps 12 pounds across the winter. His face had filled out. His grey eyes, when she came around the corner of the cottage with a basket of cut nettles for the pot, were the same grey eyes that had opened in October, but they were the eyes of a man who could now stand in his own weight. "You walk," she said, "considerably better." "I have been threatened," he said gravely, "by my grandmother, with the loss of Pudding's affection if I did not." "Pudding has chosen me." "Pudding," Julian said, "is a faithless dog." He set the lead down. Pudding sat. They considered each other for a long moment, the Duke and the music master's daughter, in the small, wet sunshine of an April morning in the Wensleydale. "Elowen." "Yes?" "I have not brought a question." "You have not." "I have, however, brought a request. Will you walk with me?" "I will." They walked. They did not, for the first half-mile, speak. They went up the green hill behind the cottage, and the grass was new under their boots, and the lambs in the fold below them complained at their mothers and were ignored. At the top of the hill, there was a low stone wall, much fallen, where Elowen had played as a child, and she sat on the wall, and Julian, slightly out of breath, but not so out of breath as he would have been a month ago, sat beside her. The valley spread below them. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the question I am not asking." "Have you?" "At length." "And what have you thought?" What he should like, he said, if she had considered him this winter, and decided she could bear him as a man and not as a memory, was to come to this cottage in May with his grandmother, and ask her, in the dowager's presence, the question he had been not asking. Properly. In daylight. With words he had prepared. With her goat present, if her goat insisted. And then, he should like, should she answer in the affirmative, to take her home. To a house that had been waiting for her since October, and which he had, with great difficulty, refrained from filling with cut flowers in the meantime. Elowen, sitting on the wall, looking at the green valley, with the wind moving the loose hair at her temple, answered nothing for some time. Julian did not press. He sat beside her, his hands loose on his knees, his grey eyes on the same valley. "Julian." "Yes?" "I have considered you all winter." "I had hoped." "And I have not changed my mind." "That is alarmingly ambiguous, Elowen." "It was meant to be," she said. She turned her head and looked at him. She had not changed her mind from October. She had not changed it from April. She had not changed it from any of the 7 years she had sung to him, although she had not, in those years, known what to call what she was doing. She was doing it still. She expected to do it for some time. "Do not torment me, woman." "I am not. I am answering you." "You are answering me." "I am answering," Elowen said. "Yes." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, she saw that the man who had been thrown from a horse at 21, and had slept 7 years, and had stood up in November in a court of chancery, and faced down his own kin, that man was, on this small stone wall in the Yorkshire wind, perhaps 40 seconds short of weeping. He did not weep. He had not wept yet, in any season. But he reached for her hand, and turned it over in his, exactly as he had done on the night of the eve of the hearing, and ran his thumb across the calluses on her fingertips, and said, "You will marry me." "In May, with your grandmother, with my goat." "With your goat." "He is called Mr. Henshaw." "I am aware." "I named him so, the morning Pudding chose me." "I am aware of that as well, Elowen. I have eyes, I read the papers. May I kiss you?" "You may." He did. Carefully, not as a man unsure of how, but as a man who had thought with great patience about how, and was unwilling to do it badly. The kiss tasted of cold wind and salt, and the small tremor of 2 people no longer separated by a wall. When he lifted his head, his hand had moved from hers to the back of her neck, and he held her there for a moment more, his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her cheek, and he said very quietly, almost as if he were afraid of being overheard by the wind. "Sing for me. Now. On the wall. Julian, what shall I sing?" "The river one," he said. "The one your mother taught you. I believe I've rather earned the right to hear it from the first verse." So she sang. There on the green hill, on the low stone wall, with the lambs complaining in the fold below, and Mr. Henschel the goat watching from the cottage wall, and Pudding, at the bottom of the path, sitting again in muddy protest, she sang the river and sea song, from the first line to the last, with her hand in his hand, and his breath warm against her temple. He did not interrupt her. He did not move. He listened with the close, complete attention of a man who had heard her for 7 years, and was, only now, hearing her with everything that he was. When she had finished, he said, "Never stop." "I shall not stop." "Good," said the Duke of Ravensford, and he did, at last, put his face into her shoulder. And Elowyn Ashcombe, music master's daughter, 25 years old, sole survivor of her family, future Duchess of Ravensford, who had sung for 7 years to an empty room and had been answered, set her own hand at the back of his head and held him there in the April wind. And the river found the sea. They were married in May, in the parish church a half-mile from Ravensford Hall, on a Tuesday morning that smelled of cut grass and new rain. The church was a small stone building with a square Norman tower and a churchyard full of names Elowyn had read on stones since she was a child. It had stood there, in some form, for 700 years, and had married Ravensfords at one end and music masters at the other, for so many of them that the village had stopped commenting on the distance between the two. The hawthorns along the churchyard wall were in full white blossom. Bees were thick in the cherry tree by the lich gate. Inside the church, the curate had set candles in every window and a great spray of green hellebore beside the altar, and the morning light came through the small leaded panes in long, slow bars across the flagstones. The dowager wore a peacock blue silk gown that had not been out of its press in 11 years. Mrs. Harrow wept once, briefly, into her best handkerchief, and resumed dignity. Dr. Calder gave the bride away in lieu of her father, with, he insisted, the music master's full retrospective approval. Pudding attended, in a small lace ruff he had ferociously resented being put into, and Mr. Henschel the goat, by the bride's specific request, was tied loosely to a yew tree in the churchyard and bleated through the vows. There was no large wedding breakfast. The dowager refused to permit it. There were 40 guests, all known, all loved, in the long gallery at the hall, and there was a single long table, and there was a fiddler who was a cousin of the village smith. And there was, at the end of the evening, a moment when the candles had burned down and the guests had gone, and the household had gone to its rooms, when the Duke and his new Duchess sat alone in the green chamber where she had slept on the night he woke. He had moved her things into it that afternoon. Not the bedchamber from her 7 years on the stool. Never that room. The green chamber across from the dowager's. He had had the fire lit and a pot of tea brought up, and he had sent everyone away, and he had taken off his coat and his neckcloth, and was sitting in his shirt sleeves on the small velvet bench at the end of the bed, watching her unpin her hair at the dressing table. "Elowyn." "Yes?" "You sang at the church." "I am told it is traditional." "You sang the river and sea song." "I am told you requested it in a letter to the curate in March." "It is possible." She set the last hairpin down, turned in her chair and looked at him. "Julian." "Yes, my heart." "You have been awake 7 months." "I have." "I have known you, in the sense in which a person knows a person, for 7 months." "You have, and before that, of course." His grey eyes were warm. "For 7 years. Differently. Through a wall." "Through a wall." "The wall is down." "It is." She rose. She crossed the small space of the green chamber in her plain white nightgown, with her chestnut hair down her back, and she sat on the bench beside him, and she put her head on his shoulder, and his arm came up, slowly, deliberately, like everything he did, and settled around her waist. The fire spoke softly to itself. "I have not asked you," he said. "What? What woke me?" "Julian, it is a fair question. I have lived with it. I have not asked it of you. I am asking now, in this room, on this night, because I think now I am permitted." She thought about this for a moment. "I do not know what woke you, Julian. I have asked Calder. He does not know. I have asked the Dowager. She does not know. What do you think?" "I think," she said slowly, "that you woke because the river found the sea. I think you woke because some sounds, sung long enough and patiently enough, become the way home." "That is not a medical answer." "I am not a doctor. I am a music master's daughter." "You are the Duchess of Ravensford." "As of 9 hours ago, yes. But I was a music master's daughter for 25 years before that, and I shall, I think, be a music master's daughter for some time after." "You will sing to our children when we have them." "I will." "You will sing in this house every dusk." "I will." "Forever." She lifted her head. She looked at him in the firelight, her duke, her sleeper, her grey-eyed husband, his face still slightly thinner than it ought to have been, his hand at her waist, his expression suddenly grave in a way that made her chest ache. "Yes," she said. "Forever." "Never stop." "I shall not stop." He smiled then, the small, half-laughing smile that had become his, that was different from the smile of his portraits at 20, that had been earned in a different life from the one those portraits remembered. He put his forehead against hers. "Elowen." "Yes?" "Sing me something, anything, quietly, so the Dowager does not hear and weep again." "You did not weep, Julian." "I have been waiting," he said, "for a private hour." So she sang to him, very softly, in the green chamber of Ravensford Hall, with the fire low, and his arm around her, and the candles burnt half down. And he listened, with his eyes closed, and his hand on her hand, and after a little while she felt the small tremor in his shoulders, and she did not stop. He had asked her never to stop. She had given him her answer. She kept singing. The river found the sea. Outside, the spring wind moved the new leaves of the great oak by the lane, and the long lights of the upper gallery winked out one by one, and Ravensford Hall, for the first time in 7 years and 1 winter, went to sleep with its master awake within it, and the music master's daughter at his shoulder, and a voice he had heard for 7 years, still moving through the rooms of the house, like the slow returning tide that had, at last and after all, brought them home.